Hello. Today we will begin a discussion on ethics for the course, which will have to pertain with ethics with your instructor, W. Russell Crawford. I'm just kidding. Obviously, I don't smoke a pipe, but if you speak with a British accent and a rich baritone voice, you seem like you're a little more intelligent. So now we have that goofy joke out of the way. What we want to do is, first off, let me just go ahead and introduce you to this course in ethics. Now, what we want to think about when we begin this discussion is the fact that ethics itself is obviously a sub-branch of philosophy. So sometimes these topics or this particular branch of philosophy, this sub-discipline of philosophy, will come under, say, even an intro or an introductory to philosophy type course, because you're going to touch on some of these same questions, some of these same topics, we could say. Now, part of what I want you to do is to, hopefully, if you're in this course, I hope you're already interested in taking this journey. But if not, and even if so, to some extent, you're probably already interested in these questions or ethical considerations, rather, and you're going to see how relevant they really are in regard to your life. Now, having said that, what I do want to try and accomplish as well is to rope you into the relevancy of ethical considerations and ethical topics in regard to your everyday life. Now, if you'll look at the slide here, if we can get this thing to work. Okay, let's see. There we go. All right, so if you'll look at your slide here, we've already started to at least broach the topic of the relevancy of the study of ethics. So how relevant is the study of ethics? I want you to think of, or go ahead and consider possibly one of your favorite cinematic pieces, one of your favorite movies. Think about the plot of that particular movie. Think about what the movie revolves around. I'm willing to bet that at least 90%, if not virtually, if not practically speaking, all cinematic pieces or all movies are going to revolve around some ethical question, some ethical consideration that draws you into the importance or the seeming importance of what you're watching or what you're viewing for this entertainment here. Now, were this a live course, say, you guys were sitting in front of me and I were, in real time, I would actually ask you, I would say, hey, look, name a couple movies, pick out a couple movies, and I guarantee you that I can point out that really what's driving the interest in that movie, what's driving say you're sitting on the edge of your seat in that, is there's some sort of ethical consideration going on, no matter what the movie is. Think of, off the top of my head, Superman, right? Think of any of those versions, they've made them out the yin yang now. These versions of the Superman franchise type movies. Now, let's just take, for example, Superman having to do whatever, right? Now, in most cases, it's him having to save, the hapless or bumbling humans from, General Zod or whoever the case may be, whoever the bad guys may be in that regard. Now, what if you weren't thinking in terms of ethics? Meaning, when you were watching that movie, what if you just didn't care if Superman allowed, say, the humans to die, or the innocents to be slaughtered, or, say, the little old lady to get, you know, zapped by, General Zod or whoever the bad guy may be in that particular case. No, what's keeping you interested, what's keeping you involved, uh, what's keeping you on the edge of your seat is that you feel like there's some sort of sense, or there's some sense of the rightness. And I mean that in the most robust sense of the word possible. You feel like there's a rightness, there's an oughtness for Superman, right? To keep these individuals from being attacked by someone that we would see as bad or deem a bad guy or whatever, a villain. But what if you didn't think in those type of categories? Again, how interesting would the movie be if no one felt as if Superman or whoever your hero is has any sort of obligation at all to quote unquote do the right thing? What if no one thought like that? How interesting would these movies be? How would you be on the edge of your seat? No, not at all. It wouldn't even matter. Again, now go through virtually any movie that's not, say sports driven, and even there you're going to find these considerations. But virtually any drama, any rom-com, even your typical guy's action movie, it's going to revolve around some sort of ethical consideration. Or looking at our next example just on television. At the recording of this particular lecture, The Walking Dead has already, in some sense, passed its peak of popularity. However, it does reflect something that's going on in society and society's interest in these post-apocalyptic type movies, these dystopian futures where everyone is destroyed, say a zombie virus comes in and wipes everyone out, or a nuclear disaster happens, some sort of international meltdown in some sense. Something bad has happened, right? Now, what makes these interesting is you've got these groups of individuals, and they're trying to survive, right? Now, all of a sudden, they find themselves having to make decisions like, should we kill this dude? Should we let this person live? Or hey, we've come up upon these survivors in this little neck of the woods over here. They don't know we exist. Should we overtake their village and take their supplies, even though they seem relatively peaceful? Because hey, look, if we don't, we've got these children in our village or whatever, our little tribe or whatever, that'll die if we don't go in and take some of these supplies, or if we don't overtake this village. Or should we rather work with them to try to glean more resources, and whatever the case may be. Now again, that's all of those are ethical considerations. And again, those are the deep questions that people are asking that make all of these things interesting, all of these television shows. Again, you can think of Lost, you can think of Survivor, you can think of Walking Dead, you can think of movies such as, again, The Road. Any of these movies all have to do with these heavy ethical questions. In fact, you identify with these, you just didn't realize that they already had names. So for instance, after this course, hopefully you'll be able to watch some of these movies or some of these television shows and whatnot, and you'll say, oh, look, right now they're asking these ethical questions, and that's actually the ethical theory of utilitarianism. And I really don't think that's a good theory, because here are the critiques of that. Here's why that won't work if you try to apply this long run, or it won't work if you try to use its axiom as your working ethical principle, blah, 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 blah. Hopefully you'll be able to identify these things. Nevertheless, these are what, again, keeps so much of this interesting, so much of these television shows and these forms of entertainment interesting. As if it shouldn't be obvious already, legislation, again, if you just look at this example here, legislation involves heavy ethical considerations, right? You know, what does it mean to murder someone? What does it mean to commit manslaughter as opposed to murder? Is there a difference? Why ought I not steal my neighbor's property? Why not I try to advocate for a socialistic type of government over a government that revolves around capitalism of some sort, or vice versa? There's an oughtness about that, right? You feel like that, oh, well, I ought to do this as opposed to doing that. Again, these are ethical questions. These have to do with and pertain to ethics. So at this point, you may say, well, what on earth is ethics, right? Like, you know, we keep talking about that. What is ethics? So the first thing we want to do is we'll briefly talk about what ethics is, right? What is ethics? But we're going to do this, if you've noticed, I've added right here into the slide, we're going to do this from a 1,000-foot overview, right? And what I mean by that, I'm just speaking analogously in the sense that, say, for instance, if you get on Google Maps or whatever and you're looking at your hometown, it starts out, right, with a view from, you know, miles overhead. Then you can narrow down to look at something specific. And that's what we're going to do in this first lecture, is we're going to try to look at this whole topic as if we're 1,000 feet over the whole thing before we start to narrow down in on the specifics of each individual ethical theory, different considerations and whatnot. Hopefully this will make it a little easier for you, right? When we start to get down into the specifics, you'll already have a vague, though somewhat ambiguous and unconnected view, but at least we'll have already addressed some of these things beforehand, so you know where we're going with this. So we're going to start from 1,000 foot above. Now, what is ethics? Now, we're going to use there's all sorts of definitions for what ethics is. I'm going to go essentially with just a roughshod definition of the term, and we'll use basically something, a Christian philosopher like somebody like Norman Geisler's definition of that. And ethics essentially is this: it deals with what is morally right and what is morally wrong, and how you make those decisions. So that's what ethics is, right? Now, there's going to be something too in a slide in just a moment, a consideration that I want you to keep in mind, and that's going to have to do with meta-ethics. And you may be thinking, well, whoa, what on earth is meta-ethics, right? Well, if ethics is what is morally right and wrong, how do we perform these actions? Well, meta-ethics just means beyond ethics. What grounds these considerations, right? So, okay, look, we've got this ethical system that says in this situation, this is what you're supposed to do to perform the right action. Well, then the deeper question is, well, who says or what says that that's the right action? Why ought I do that, right? Like, why should I do that? All right, you've got this little ethical system that says when you get in situation X or circumstance Q, then this is what you're supposed to do. But why ought I do that? Like, what makes that ethical theory in and of itself, quote unquote, right or wrong or correct morally, right? Or why do I have an obligation to follow even that particular ethical theory? And that will have that pertains to meta-ethics, which again could have its own course. You could have an entire course in meta-ethics, but I do want us to keep in consideration even these meta-ethical concerns while we're talking about ethics here. Now, just a little background, just so you know, just toss in for free. Well, I guess it isn't free. You're in the course. But just to toss in, meta-ethics was given by Aristotle in the sense of he had all of his treatises lined up or whatever. And when he did his work on the physics, after that came the metaphysics. Now, there's been speculation. Some meant that when Aristotle was talking about metaphysics after the physics, it just literally meant in chronological order. Meta meaning after or beyond, and he did this after he talked about physics, and so it's just after, right, or beyond. But others take a more abstract approach to that, and I think they're right in this, is meaning that well, you've got the physics, you've got the particulars, but metaphysics deals with the beyondness or the grounding or what the isness, the whatness of those, even the physics themselves. And again, that's very rough, a bit oversimplified, but that's where we're also, when we talk about meta-ethics, it's roughly similar to that. Now, look at your PowerPoint here. What is ethics, descriptive and prescriptive? Again, if we were face to face, I would just stop at this point and say, well, what do you think the difference is? What do you think the difference is between a descriptive ethical theory and a prescriptive ethical theory? All right, let's talk about it. Descriptive roughly just means a description, right? I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. So it describes how a society or how individuals are acting. Meaning that, in fact, you see this a lot in Scripture, right? You'll see you're flipping through the Bible or whatever, and it records how people act, or it records how Israel is acting. Though it's not necessarily saying that that's how you ought to act, right? It's not necessarily saying that, David is on the rooftop or whatever and sees someone's wife, and he goes to this elaborate scheme in order to get his new bride. It's not saying that you ought to do that. It's merely what? Describing his ethical behavior at that point. Now, strictly speaking, we're going to look at we'll use this word for lack of better terms at the moment, a theory called moral relativism. Now, that would fit under what we would call something like a descriptive type ethic. Even though, technically speaking, moral relativism is not an ethical theory. It's more like an amoral observation, meaning this is just what societies do, this is just what a particular individual does. But we'll look at that in more depth when we talk about moral relativism. So let's skip down to, or go over here on your PowerPoint to the most important aspect of this little sentence when we talk about what is ethics, and look at prescriptive. So if we contrast prescriptive with descriptive, right? If you think that if descriptive is just describing how people and or societies or cultures act, what do you think that prescriptive, what do you think the prescriptive aspect of that is? I'm just going to give you a moment to think about that. And here's a hint, think about a pharmacy. All right, there you go. So you could have pushed pause if you want to think about that, but if not, here we go. Prescriptive is just essentially what? Prescribing, right? Again, think about a pharmacy or think about a doctor or whoever. It's prescribing certain moral actions or a right and a wrong choice, right? Meaning that you're supposed to act this way, right? Or you're supposed to act in such a way, right, that this will be the outcome or whatever. So here's a word we'll probably use a whole lot during this particular course, is oughtness. So the word ought, like, hey, you ought to go to the store right now, right? Or you ought to blah, 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 or whatever. There's an oughtness about prescriptive ethical theories, and which, by the way, all of these, except when we look at moral relativism, all of these want to give you the oughtness. That is, all of these, aside from moral relativism, dub themselves or would label themselves as prescriptive ethical theories, meaning that if the ethical theory runs, if it works, so to speak, if it's true, then it's a prescriptive ethical theory, meaning that you ought to, right, perform some sort of course of action. Because again, it's prescriptive. It's giving you a prescription in regards to your moral behavior, so to speak. Now, there's another, just as we've mentioned, there's descriptive and prescriptive type ethics. There's look at your slide here, a deontological ethical system, or systems rather, versus teleological ethical systems. Now, your deontological type systems are going to be concerned with the principle right then, right there, right? Meaning that and best way to say it is this: they're not concerned about per se, as their axiom. They're not concerned about the consequences that may or may not result of some particular ethical choice. Now, we want to contrast that with the teleological ethical systems. Now, you're probably somewhat familiar with the term teleological because you're thinking maybe the teleological type argument. And in modern connotations, that would have something to do with a design type argument, right? However, and this is important, the old school design type arguments, the old school teleological arguments, were more in line with what this word actually means here, of telos, right, or teleological. And that has to do with an end goal, right, an end direction, so to speak, a purpose, right, that there's a purpose to something. Now, one of your ethical theories in particular that we'll get to later in the course will really head in on this type of meaning of the word. But it's kind of used, this word teleological is used a little loosely in regards to some of these ethical systems, because this connotation of teleological is they're just saying that if this ethical theory works, the whole point of this particular ethical theory, whatever it is, whichever ethical theory we're discussing at that point, the goal of that ethical theory is, no pun intended, the goal of that ethical theory is the end, right? The end goal, right? The consequence. So sometimes these type of ethical systems, these teleological ethical systems, are called consequentialist ethical theories, meaning that they go towards the consequences of what's going on, right? As opposed to the deontological, which has to do with the principle right then and right there. So you've probably heard your mama say, right? The ends don't justify the means, right? They're saying that what makes it right or wrong is this particular principle, this particular rule, this particular duty right here, right now, in this instance. You don't worry about the consequences. That's not what's important, right? On the other hand, these teleological type systems say, no, 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 no. In fact, one in particular we'll look at is completely, absolutely concerned with the consequences. And they would say it's exactly the consequences that make something right or something wrong. So right now you're probably thinking, well, oh man, like, yeah, I've noticed that. I've noticed that sometimes in my life I have even maybe argued something like, doesn't matter what's right or wrong on down the road. Well, let me rephrase that. Doesn't matter what happens down the road. What matters is what I do right now in this particular situation. Well, if you're doing that, then you're probably employing some sort of deontological type system. However, on the other hand, you've probably caught yourself saying, like, well, I could do this, but man, if I do this, then this will happen to my family or my kids or whatever, 20 years from now, and so I need to do this instead. Well, now you may be using or employing some sort of teleological type ethical system, or even possibly a consequentialist type ethic. Now, here's the rub. Those are supposed to be in contrast with one another, and those are supposed to be, well, let me say it this way. One is supposed to be right, and the other is supposed to be wrong. So how do we reconcile that, right? I mean, already we seem like, all right, well, maybe I'm not a very consistent human being, right? Or maybe I'm not a very consistent thinker if I'm jumping back and forth between how I believe I'm supposed to make ethical decisions and or ethical considerations. So hopefully we'll get into that in the course, and hopefully we'll kind of cash out some of that, flesh a little bit of that out, because what we want to do is people, specifically the type of people that you would call yourself right now, is you want to develop not just a systematic or consistent worldview, but what comes along with that is obviously how you make your ethical decisions, right? How you determine right from wrong, and how you act in accord with your beliefs or your principles or whatnot. So, not only do you want to have a consistent worldview, but part of having a consistent worldview means that you're going to have a consistent way in which you go about your ethic, uh, the way you go about in making moral decisions. How are we supposed to do that, right? Now, there's one system in particular that I think that is going to, this is my personal view. Of course, you'll have to make this decision yourself as you read and you study our texts here, our textbooks and additional readings and whatnot. But I think that there's going to be one view that stands, I think, heads and shoulders above the rest of the ethical theories. Now, what I mean by that is I'm not going to say that I don't think that that particular view has any problems, any difficulties. In fact, any of the views that we look at are going to have difficulties, right? They're going to have problems. And what you're going to have to try to figure out, and hopefully this course will help you do that, what you'll need to do is say, well, all right, look, each view has some sort of difficulty that maybe I'm not necessarily comfortable with, but there are some that are so abysmal that there's just no way that I can hold to some sort of that type of theory. There's just no way that I can hold to that type of ethical theory. And then you're going to have to say, and though there's this one over here that does have some difficulties, these are existentially viable, meaning I can live with this. This isn't necessarily incoherent at its core. This isn't contradictory at its core, or this doesn't result in absolute absurdity in the philosophical sense, in the logical sense of the word, or hopefully the morally relevant sense of the word. So I think that you're gonna recognize that, you're gonna see that, and some of these I will just lay my cards flat on the table, and I'll say I just do not believe that you in good well, I can't say about your conscience, but I cannot in good conscience even teach this, some of these theories as a viable system of ethics or a viable mode of behavior. Notably, I'll go ahead and say right now, I'll drop my bias right in front of you right now, something like moral relativism, right? In fact, I would even venture to say, I'll just go ahead and be so bold as to say, I hope that by the time we finish discussing moral relativism, that there will never be a time in your life, at least from this point forward, that you think that moral relativism is any sort of viable option for you as you approach the topic of ethics, right? Now, having said that, what are some of these ethical theories? What are we going to be looking at here? What are some of these systems that we're going to look at? Or, to word it a little more formally, on which ethical system, wait a minute, I'll get my pipe here. On which ethical systems shall we peruse? Right? All right, so let's look at some of those. Again, I don't even have to go over this point because we've already mentioned this, but just to keep in mind, a quick word regarding these meta-ethical considerations and the goal of these ethical systems. Remember, each one of these, if they work, then they are supposed to give you what? The right and the wrong types of moral choices to make, right? Or the right and wrong action that you should take in some sort of circumstance, in some sort of moral circumstance. You're supposed to take that action, right? So, having said that, let's look at some of these. We're going to look at moral relativism. Again, kind of keep in mind our 1,000-foot overview here. We're going to look at moral relativism, and we're going to divide that up into something like an individual type of relativism. Some thinkers like Frank Beckwith, moral philosopher, he likes to call it something like that, I say relativism. Pretty self-explanatory, right? If it's individual, then you could, maybe say something like, well, that's an I say sort of relativism. Now, in regards to cultural or societal, there's a type of relativism in regards to that, right? A cultural type relativism. And again, same thinker would say something like a society says type relativism. Sometimes this is called conventionalism, right? That, society will say this or whatever, this is right, this is wrong, as a whole, as a society, and sometimes that will be called conventionalism. Now, you'll notice on the slide here that there's something called ethical egoism. Now, we may discuss this as we discuss moral relativism. Because moral relativism, if you'll remember, is not, strictly speaking, an ethical theory. It's something more like an moral theory. And meaning, so think of atheism, the Greek prefix combined with theism would mean no God, something like that, right? From the Greek prefix. So when I say moral, it means like no, right? The negation, the Greek negation there. There's no sorts of ethics or whatever. Now, ethical egoism, strictly speaking, is not, and again, very strictly speaking, is supposed to be not amoral or whatnot. It's just to say that, and I may save this, I don't want to get too deep into it because I want to save it in case we do speak about it under moral relativism. But it's supposed to be an ethical theory, meaning that you're supposed to act in a certain way. I just want to say something like, I just want to kind of argue something like that moral relativism or ethical egoism is really just moral relativism in a really bad tuxedo, but maybe we'll get into that later. By the way, let's go ahead and say this. Moral relativism is probably the prevailing view in regard to not just ethics, of course, but just the prevailing moral view in our culture right now. And in our culture, I'm referring to modern Western society. It's kind of a sad thing. Hopefully you'll see that it's more than a sad thing when we begin to look and when we start to digest and look at the implications, some of the logical implications of what moral relativism actually will result in if it is, again, carried out or lived out in a consistent fashion, consistent manner. And again, as I've just said, we may look at ethical egoism as well, and then hopefully you would see why I would say something like that. Ethical egoism is really just moral relativism in a tuxedo, right? So we'll look at that. Now, the next ethical theory, and I'm not sure we'll do them necessarily in this order. I'm fairly confident we'll do them in this order, but just go ahead and say that as a disclaimer. But the next will be utilitarianism. And again, this is all right. Now, I should have said this to begin with as I clicked over to the slide. Now we're actually looking at real ethical systems, right? Now we're actually looking at ones that that don't claim to be amoral or just describing behavior. What we're looking at now, starting with utilitarianism here, technically with ethical egoism, but starting with utilitarianism right now, what we're looking at is these are the ethical systems that want to say this is how you ought to act. Meaning they're trying to figure out and ground, and again, this is our meta-ethical consideration. They're not only just trying to show you how to act, but try to ground what really is right and what really is wrong. And if you perform such and such an action, basing it off these ethical principles, right, that utilitarianism would give you, and the others that we'll mention, that if you put these principles into play, then you're a good person, right? Then you're living in the way in which you ought to live. Again, that word, ought. Remember, these are prescribing ethical behaviors here, or actions that you ought to take, the way you're supposed to live, right? So utilitarianism, if we go back to and think about our two camps of ethical theories, this is a teleological ethical system, right? Meaning that utilitarianism, if it works, well, even before it works, but it's concerned with the consequences, the end result, right? What happens on down the line is what makes something right or wrong, and we're going to look at that. We're going to look at some of the possible pros of that position, the possible benefits, or let's put it this way, some of the attraction of that position or this theory as an ethical theory, but we're going to look at some of the difficulties of it as well. And again, keep in mind these meta-ethical considerations. Remember, because if utilitarianism works, if its axiom works, if its core principle holds, then this is supposed to give you the good, right? The good, what is right, right, and how you're supposed to act in regard to that. Now, what's our next? Oh, well, first let me say this, looking at your slide, act and rule variation. So, even within utilitarianism, and this is a consequentialist type ethic, even within this, you're going to have something like an act utilitarianism, and you're going to have something like a rule utilitarianism. Don't worry about what that means for right now. I'm just going, and again, we're just doing a 1,000-foot overview. So you've got utilitarianism, and even that can be kind of subdivided into act and rule variations of that particular ethical theory. Now, deontological ethics. Remember, this is the right here and the right now, this principle, this duty, this is what makes something right or wrong. Not necessarily the consequences, right? It's what, well, and I shouldn't even say not necessarily, just not the consequences. It really is about this particular rule right here, right now, right? Now, we're going to look specifically at the Kantian version. And when I say Kantian, I'm referring to the modern era philosopher, Enlightenment era philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And by the way, when philosophers say something like modern era, they're not talking about modern as in like right now. I know that's ridiculous, but there would be now, if you're talking about the era of right now, philosophy right now, it's called contemporary philosophy. The modern era is similar to or related to the Enlightenment era of philosophy. So roughly from the time of René Descartes to Friedrich Nietzsche, right around the end of the 19th century. So right at the end of the 1800s there, you've got something like, again, Descartes all the way to Nietzsche. That would be the modern era. Anyway, that's just there for your own whatever. So, I want you to know at the outset that divine command theory is also a deontological type ethical theory, right? But we're going to look at that specifically. We're going to look at that by itself. We're going to look at that individually as its own ethical theory. Even though a lot of times people will go ahead when they're looking at ethics and theories of ethics, they'll just kind of lump all these together, this Kantian version, divine command theory. But really, they seriously don't need, in my estimation, they just don't need to be lumped together. These two theories need to be lumped or viewed separately. Now remember, Kantian ethics, or Kantian version of deontological ethics is obviously a deontological ethic, but so is divine command theory, and so will some of these others that we're about to look at. Now, natural law theory. This is probably, now some of them are very convoluted and difficult to evaluate, difficult to put into practice. This is going to kind of have a bit of, it's going to be both of those in some sense, meaning that it may be the most philosophical, it may be the most abstract to understand. Now, but here's the irony, is that if this ethical system is true, then you're already doing it. So in that sense, you would already be doing and utilizing and putting into practice this ethical theory, or let me be a little more specific. Most people would already be doing, all things being equal, most people are already utilizing this ethical system, though they don't even realize it, due to the nature of the intellect and so on, some of these things that we'll discuss when we actually talk about natural law theory. Now, we should also say as well that natural law theory is also a teleological type system. But remember, when it says teleological, remember, more nuanced, this is, again, philosophy. When we're talking about philosophical topics, we have to be very nuanced at times. But it's not necessarily saying the consequences, though it is concerned with that. It's not just saying the consequences. It's talking about the end goal or the purpose of a thing in and of itself, right? Meaning if there's a thing that exists, then the thing in question has a purpose or an end goal in and of itself. And so ethics, specifically in regard to people, has very much and everything to do with that end goal or purpose. And we'll get into and we'll talk about this in much more detail when we look at it. Now, it is important to realize and important to point out that the framing of the Constitution had a lot to do with this, or even the Bill of Rights, those sorts of things had a lot to do with this particular ethical theory. It was lurking around in the background, so to speak. You can kind of see this when you read through the historical document there. Now, natural law theory, some people will take this completely by itself as if it's its own ethical theory in and of itself, but some will combine it with our next ethical theory, which is virtue theory. Now, virtue theory, and again, we're going to look at these. Again, don't worry about if you're confused or if you feel bogged down. Remember, we're going to go into these. We're going to go into each of these specifically, right? So you don't have to worry about that in that regard. We're just, again, 1,000-foot overview. We're looking, we're standing in the very top of a tree, just looking down at the ground, trying to get a overall scheme of what we're going to go and as we flow through the course, so to speak. So virtue theory. Let me say it this way. Have you ever heard your parents, maybe your grandmother, whoever, say something like, "Look, I'm getting on to you right now because I don't want you just to act a certain way. I want you to become a certain type of person." Right? Meaning, I don't want you to just run around doing good things. I want you to become the kind of person that you just become a good person, right? Now, this is what virtue theory has more to do with, meaning that, well, let me step back. Let me again take another step back and say it this way. Some of our ethical theories here are all about some particular choice that you make. And in light of that choice, you're either doing the right thing or you're doing the wrong thing. Now, some of the ancient thinkers, some of the old school thinkers, some of the thinkers, classical philosophers would say, well, that might be kind of a dim view of people. Maybe that's kind of a dim view of man, is that everything's just about duty and one moral choice versus another. And they might say something like this. They might say something like, wouldn't it be better to become the kind of person that wants to do the right thing? Not just that you're a person who's trying to do the right thing, but what if you could become the person that you actually turn into the kind of thing that wants to behave and act a certain way? So the good life, right? So when you think now in terms of quote unquote the good life, modern society, contemporary society says the good life is something like, beer and bikinis and babes or some boats, all this kind of stuff, right? Not so with the classical philosophers and the classical thinkers. They would say something like the good life. No, the good life has nothing to do with material possessions or having a bunch of entertainment and amusing this, that, or the other. The good life has to do with the type of person that you are becoming, right? Meaning that your ethical decisions, your ethical considerations are making you into the good, right? Your life is aligning with the abstract conception of the good. That is the good life. You're living the good life, meaning you may be completely broke, or you may be jobless, or your health may even be terrible, but you're still, they would say, living the good life, because again, the good life has nothing necessarily to do with material possessions or again, babes and boats and bikinis and beer and whatnot. It has to do with this type of person that you're turning into, that you're becoming. And this has something to do, or not has something to do, but has a lot to do with virtue theory and what this ethical theory espouses. So this is a completely irrelevant chart at this point. Just to put there to make sure you're paying attention. I'm just kidding. So hopefully that's going to round out what we're looking at right now in regard to our ethical theories. So this has been kind of a 1,000-foot overview, but a couple concluding thoughts here. We're just flipping back through the slides, looking at some of what we've discussed thus far. Sometimes it's tossed out. These are just some logical considerations. So as we conclude this, I want you to think of a few things logically. A lot of people will espouse that there's no right or wrong actions. And, sometimes in a typical philosophy class, they may toss out something like what is considered a moral dilemma. And based upon different reactions to that moral dilemma, some will try to argue that there just is no right course of action, and they'll say, look, all of these people disagree on this particular what ought to be done, so how can you say there's a real thing, a real right, a real wrong in this particular scenario X when no one can agree with what ought to be done? In fact, you see this all the time on talk shows, on modern, contemporary news media outlets, some social media, arguments with your friends and whatever. They'll say, well, look, you say we're supposed to do this, he says they're supposed to do that. Look, see, nobody knows what they're supposed to do. But notice that logically it doesn't follow that if people disagree on a difficult moral dilemma, some moral consideration, that if people disagree, it doesn't follow logically that there's not a right answer. So look at it this way. My wife, she's taught, in a public school for, a decade and a half or so. And part of what she teaches is mathematics, right? Now imagine if she puts a difficult equation on the board, right? And she asks the students, all right, what is the right answer to this equation? And if you guys were here with me, I'd just write one on the board here. And let's say that no one knows the answer, right? It's just a difficult question, a difficult equation, and no one comes to the answer. Does it logically follow that therefore, since no one knows the answer, or that because everyone disagrees, let's say they all get the thing wrong, that since they all disagree that there's just not a right answer? Does it follow logically from that? No. It doesn't follow at all, right? It doesn't follow that if there's disagreement on a mathematical question or a question of geography or historiography or any of these sorts of things, that there's a wrong, or that there's not a right or wrong answer to the thing. All that follows when you have lack of consensus is what? Lack of consensus, right? That's what follows from a lack of consensus. And notice as well that a lot of times when people toss out these difficult moral dilemmas or considerations, these moral questions, notice they never just give an easy one, right? They always want to jump to the hard case scenario, which there's no problem with looking at hard case scenarios. It's just that you can't try to use those to justify there's not right or wrong actions just because there's a hard case. In fact, if you've got a pretty bright student in the classroom, and this is what you love to see on social media, is that let's say the professor or whoever tosses out a very difficult moral situation, or a situation that involves a difficult moral decision, it'd be wonderful just to see a class or a student say, well, wait a minute. I had a math class one time, or I had a history question one time, or I had a social exam one semester where no one got the right answer. Didn't follow there wasn't one, just followed maybe that we're all idiots or that we don't know, right? Or we haven't developed in our education long enough, or we're not far enough in the journey to help us evaluate difficult choices, right? It would be fantastic to kind of see that, as opposed to just watching students just swallow hook, line, and sinker the false false implication there that there's not a right answer just because they're difficult situations. Again, you may have heard of the trolley car example. That's supposed to be a difficult moral dilemma. You may have heard of the lifeboat example. You've got this, you've got an old lady, you've got a paralyzed woman, you've got a young child, you've got a criminal, and you've got a doctor on a lifeboat. However, it can't support all of them. At least one must be thrown overboard. Who do you throw overboard and why? And then everybody disagrees. Ha ha ha, see, look, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Well, it just doesn't follow, right? It's a difficult question. It doesn't follow that there's not a right answer because there's disagreement. What logically follows from a lack of consensus is, again, a lack of consensus. Now, hopefully that's enough to give you a rough overview of what we'll be looking at here. And again, if we look at some of these, what we've talked about thus far is this relevant? Hopefully we've seen that it's relevant, right? It's not just a bunch of abstract goofiness. You're making ethical considerations every single day of your life. You're involved in ethical dilemmas every single day of your life in the form of entertainment when you watch movies and television and whatnot. When we consider rules as far as legislation goes or law, view from 1,000 feet above, what is ethics, right? All deontological versus teleological ethical systems. We're going to look at moral relativism, possibly ethical egoism. We're going to look at utilitarianism as an ethical theory. We're going to look at natural law theory as an ethical theory. We're going to look at deontological, Kantian deontological theory as an ethical theory, and divine command theory, virtue theory. We're going to try to get through a lot of these and look through a lot of these. So, having said that, enjoy the rest of your day. Watch this again if you need to. Flip through the PowerPoints if you need to. And I appreciate your time. And in the words of that August philosopher, Matthew McConaughey, and since I do have a southern accent as well, I'll try to capitalize on that and say, all right, all right, all right.